go. Well, good day everyone. Welcome to week number 32 here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. 32 weeks in, or the 32nd week that we're up to now, basically means there's only 2 weeks left until Christmas, essentially, or 2 weeks left until we start the New Testament anyway. And I'm sure many of you have been very much looking forward to that as we've been working our way through the difficult era of the divided kingdom and the prophetic ministry that's come as a result of that time, although I'm sure you had a little bit of fun last week in the book of Daniel particularly. Well, this week we are, in the next 2 weeks, we're basically entering really a whole new era of time for God's people. And so before we look at the readings this week, I thought I'd take a bit of a step back and remind us of something of the journey we've been on so far in the Old Testament chronology, certainly. I have these printed out on the reading schedule, if you printed that out and have that in your paper Bible. And I also detail this in a lot of more detail in a chapter in my book, You Can Handle the Truth. There's a whole chapter there devoted to this. But essentially we've seen, well, this will be number 6, key eras of time in the development of God's people. Essentially, we started in the book of Genesis with what I like to call the Age of the Ancients. So from Adam through to Abram, the first 11 chapters basically, where God was essentially dealing with one man, okay? Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abram, okay? God's relationship with one individual man or individual men over that period. Well, the Age of the Ancients soon became in Genesis the age of the patriarchs or the fathers, as God blesses Abram, changes his names to Abraham, and from there the story of one man becomes the story of one covenant family. Well, by the time we come to Moses, Moses becomes now the first judge of God's people as God's people become a nation. One man became one family, became one nation under the leadership of judges. The last judge, Samuel, turns God's people into a kingdom, King Saul, David and Solomon. And so we see one man that became one family, that became one nation, now becomes one kingdom. After Solomon's death, that kingdom is split into two. How could we forget that era? And so we go from the period of the unified kingdom to the period of the divided kingdom. One man became one family, became one nation, became one kingdom, became two kingdoms. Well, this week, after that period of exile in Babylon, those two kingdoms, or one really, because remember Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom while God kept his covenant with Judah down the south. When those people now from Judah now begin to come back from captivity as foretold by the prophets previously, we enter now into a period of restoration. Well, at least a restoration of sorts. And this is what I like to call the era of Second-Temple Judaism. Okay, the people of Judah now begin to be called very commonly the Jews. Okay, that's where the word Jews comes from. It's the men of Judah. Okay, and so in this period of time, essentially we have 3 narrative books, Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther. We also have 3 minor prophets, which are all pretty easy to read. But a bit of a heads up. The Old Testament in these next 2 weeks does end with a bit of an anti-climax, okay? Yes, there is a restoration, but it's only a restoration of sorts. It's certainly nowhere near all the great 5 R's, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that the prophets have been prophesying, this great restoration. It's a bit of an anti-climactic restoration, where essentially God's people enter into an era where they have all form but no substance. All right, they practice God's principles and patterns to a degree, but they don't experience his glory presence. God is still with them in a sense, but his glory has still not returned to them. And believe it or not, as we'll see this week, can you believe it? There are still some more doom and gloom prophecies ahead for God's people. So while good news is coming, at some point in the future, okay, there's also some doom and gloom up ahead again. Well, here we go. Let's have a look. In this video, basically, I'll be covering, or just having a brief look, let's say, at 4 books that we'll be hitting this week, 2 narrative and 2 prophetic books. So let's go. Well, the main book we're hitting into this week is the book of Ezra. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah originally were one book in the Hebrew Bible, written by Ezra. As named after him, basically. Not because he's the main character, but because he's the author. And as you can tell, if you just sneak back to the end of Chronicles, just have a look at the last couple of verses of 2nd Chronicles, you'll notice it's basically a copy and paste for Ezra chapter 1, okay? So it's the same author following on seamlessly from those two books. And like Chronicles, it's quite meticulous in its detail and very structured. So we're back to something that's quite easy to read as far as narrative goes. But like Daniel, who we read this previous week, it contains both Hebrew and Aramaic language. Because of course in Babylon, which is now Persia, okay, Babylon, remember, gets taken out by the Persians. Now in that area, they're speaking Aramaic, and so both languages are used, not that you can really tell in English, but anyway, that's just there. The book of Ezra is mainly narrative. As I said, it's pretty straightforward, and there's plenty of timestamps, so I certainly appreciate that. And it is laid out more or less chronologically, okay? There are a few bits and pieces where something is inserted that's out of whack. And so you'll notice that, if you're paying attention, you'll notice that in chapter 4 this week, it talks about God's people facing opposition to a rebuilding, and then they insert a future opposition under another king that they have in the future. So it's basically, while I'm talking about opposition, let me include that story, and then the chronology continues. So it's a little bit out of whack there in chapter 4, but basically it's more or less chronological, except for that part. All right, so basically this week in Ezra, we're reading chapters 1 through to 6. It covers essentially a 20-year period and describes the first wave of return from Babylon, which is now Persia, okay? So, because they're in charge now. So the first wave of return to Judah and Jerusalem, there'll be 3 in total, but we cover 1 this week. And this week, Ezra is all about rebuilding the temple, okay? The first priority of God's people under the leadership of Zerubbabel is rebuilding the temple so they can restore worship, first and foremost, there in Jerusalem and Judah. The 2 main characters we're introduced to this week are Zerubbabel and Joshua. Zerubbabel is actually the great-grandson, I think, or grandson of the last one of the last kings, Jehoiachin. Okay, he was the king that was taken into exile, and a Judean king was left behind. Well, it's his grandson. Okay, but Zerubbabel is not the king of Jerusalem. Oh, well, he should come back and be the king. No, he's not the king. The king of Persia is king. Okay, Darius is king. He's in charge. So Zerubbabel comes as basically a governor. Okay, it's what we call a vassal state. God's people, the Jewish people, are not in charge of their own politics. Persia is still very much in charge of them, okay? But Zerubbabel is a governor, and he's put in charge to oversee the building of the temple. We don't see Ezra this week. He'll come next week. Don't worry about him for now. Zerubbabel's the main character. And with him is a guy called Yeshua, or Joshua, who's the high priest who's helping there with the temple worship. There's a few other key characters like Cyrus and Darius, the Persian leaders. There are the Samaritans, who we come against this week. They're basically people who, do you remember way back in Kings when the northern kingdom was taken away and the king of Assyria put some people there to live there so the land didn't turn bad, okay? Well, they're still there. They've interbred with people that were left in Jerusalem, and so they think they're Jewish, but they're not really, or maybe they are, well, we don't really know. The point is there's some contention there with the people in Samaria. But the other characters we see, critical characters that we're introduced to in Ezra this week, are the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And the reason these 2 prophets come at this period in history is because while Zerubbabel is leading God's people to rebuild the temple, they stop when that opposition comes. And Haggai and Zechariah have to come in and say, come on boys, get your act together, get going, keep rebuilding the temple. Okay, so that's the story of Ezra. Covers 20 years. Despite opposition and delay, thanks to the prophetic encouragement, they rebuild the temple. They have a celebration, but as I hinted at before, there's no glory that comes on the temple. It's not like Moses' tabernacle when they built it and the glory came. It's not like Solomon's temple. When they built it, the glory came. No glory comes to this temple, okay? There's still something about God being absent from his people during this period of time, and so it's a bit of an anticlimax when they finish the temple, but it's there this week nonetheless. Well, this wouldn't have been done were it not for the prophetic ministry of Haggai and Zechariah, so of course that's why we're reading them this week. Haggai is very straightforward. You have to do that in one sitting. It's only 2 chapters, okay, and covers a period of about 3 months that he was prophesying. He brings some words of encouragement and basically just tells them, put first things first, get your act together and keep keep building, right? Zechariah is a bit more complex or a bit more detailed. I think there's 14 chapters there, and he prophesies over 2 years. Some of his ministry is very straightforward and specific. Some of his prophecies are a bit more vague, a bit more general. We're not really sure where they fit in. And then there's a whole 6 chapters, so almost half the book, that is very mystical, okay? It's very dreamy, full of heavenly visions and imagery, much like Ezekiel and other prophets that we've seen. Zechariah operates in that kind of realm, so you'll get a little bit of the mystic stuff thrown in this week through Zechariah as well. But the worst thing is, despite their encouragement and them enthusing God's people to rebuild the temple, despite all the return and the rebuilding and the re-establishment of worship, okay, things are looking good, right? With all the great promises that we've heard before, future protection and peace and prosperity for Jerusalem, there are more predictions through Zechariah of future judgment, okay? There is another, can you believe it, day of the Lord to be suffered by Jerusalem yet again sometime in their future. What? Another day of the Lord? Yes, another day of the Lord at some point is coming. Well, thanks but no thanks to Zechariah, we know that that's coming up, all right? So that's the book of Ezra, the first 6 chapters, the 2 prophets that prophesied in that period. And then the 4th book we're looking at this week, everybody's favourite, is, well, I don't know, it's a bit of a favourite, is the book of Esther, okay? It's a great read. It reads very much like a novel, or a short story. In fact, the genre of literature is called a court tale, and it just reads really well, basically, as a good book to read to your kids. And the important thing about Esther is that the things that are taking place there are not taking place in Judah and Jerusalem. They are taking place away in Babylon, okay, or away in Persia under the kings there. Because although some of God's people, a remnant, have come back with Zerubbabel, there's still a whole bunch of them. The vast majority of the Jewish people have stayed behind in the place that has basically been their home for the last 50, 60, 70 years, all right? And that is where the story of Esther is based, up in the same area where Ezekiel was the other week, okay? We're looking up in that space. Well, we see a few characters. We see the king Xerxes, and his offsider Haman, who's basically a Nazi, okay? He basically hates the Jewish people and wants to exterminate them. We see Esther and Mordecai, who come against him with wisdom and charm, okay, and basically get their way and save God's people. So I don't want to spoil it for you, but that's basically the story. The interesting thing about Esther is that God is not mentioned. Okay, really fascinating. God's not mentioned. There's no prophecy, there's no prayer, there's no praise, there's no reference to scripture, there's no reference to worship, there's no reference to Moses. Okay, there's nothing particularly religious or spiritual about the book, and it describes God's Jewish people essentially in very secular terms. So it describes them in terms of their ethnicity and their nationality, not in religious terms or in covenantal terms. So it's very much more a historical book than it is a covenantal book describing their journey with God. But the main point of the story and why it is included in our Bible is because it does paint a message for us. All right? It does demonstrate God's favour on his people even when they're in exile. It's there, so even when God's people are away and in exile, his favour is with them. His providence is with them, even though he's not explicitly mentioned. Even when I don't see it, he's working, okay? Even when I don't feel it, he's working. God is the God who works behind the scenes. And there's another reason that it's a pivotal part of Jewish history, certainly, is that it gives the origin of a Jewish festival. Not a feast that Moses gave, but a whole new festival celebrated by Jewish people today. And I'm not even going to tell you the name of it because you're going to see that right at the end. It's a new festival. Okay, there you go. So in a sense, the book of Esther, nice little story. It doesn't really add too much to the big picture chronology of the scripture, but it does serve as a reminder that while most of the action is taking place in Judah and Jerusalem, a good portion of God's people are still away in exile. So not everyone has come back. Well, not yet anyway. In the next week, as we close out the Old Testament, we're going to see 2 more waves of return from exiles to the Promised Land, but you have to get involved with that next week. Guys, enjoy your readings, and I'll catch you then. Bye.